The lot was quiet that morning. Not peaceful. Quiet the way a room gets quiet when the wrong man walks in. Dean Martin stepped out of his car, and the salesman saw him before he saw the Mustangs lined up in rows under the California sun. That was always how it worked with Dean. People saw him first. Then they adjusted. Then they made their calculation. Then, almost always, they made their mistake. The salesman straightened his jacket. He had a pitch ready. He had a number ready. He had a whole performance mapped out in his head before Dean reached the first row of cars. What nobody knew was that Dean had already decided before he pulled into the lot. He just wanted to see how the man would handle it. That was the part that genuinely interested him, not the cars themselves. The people, always the people. How they moved when they did not think anyone important was watching. And this salesman was about to move in a way he would spend a long time thinking about afterward. It was 1965. Ford had released the Mustang the year before, and America had gone sideways over it in a way that happened maybe twice in a generation. The car was everywhere. Magazine covers, newspaper advertisements, parked outside diners and drive-ins and shopping centers from California to New York. It was not just a vehicle. It was a declaration. It was young. It was fast. It was everything that the decade was trying to become. Wrapped in steel and chrome and offered to anyone who had the money and the nerve to claim it. Dean Martin had plenty of both. He was 47 years old. He was also, by any reasonable measure, the most comfortable famous person in the world. His NBC variety show was pulling in audience numbers that network executives talked about in reverent, slightly disbelieving tones. His records were selling. His films were doing real business at the box office. The Rat Pack had become something larger than any of them had planned. A cultural institution that people referenced the way they referenced jazz or baseball, as though it had always been there and always would be. And Dean was the center of it. Not Frank, though Frank thought he was. Not Sammy, though Sammy worked the hardest. Dean. Because Dean was the one who made it look effortless. And in 1965, effortless was the most powerful thing a man could look. You know that feeling when someone underestimates you, not from cruelty, from assumption. They look at you and they sort you into a category before you have said a word, before you have given them any real information about who you are. They adjust their approach based on what they think they see. And you have a choice in that moment. You can correct them. You can get angry. You can walk away. Or you can let it play out and see where it goes. Because sometimes what a person reveals in the next 60 seconds tells you more than an hour of careful conversation ever would. Dean Martin had been underestimated so many times in his life that he had stopped being bothered by it. In Steubenville, Ohio, where he grew up in a working-class Italian neighborhood, people had told him he was a tough kid with no particular future. In the early club circuit, bookers had told him he was a decent-looking kid with a passable voice who was not quite ready for the rooms that mattered. When he partnered with Jerry Lewis, and the act became the most popular thing in American comedy for a decade, the press decided that Jerry was the talent and Dean was the straight man, the pleasant backdrop, the one who stood there and reacted. It was an arrangement that Jerry did not aggressively discourage. Every single one of those assessments turned out to be incomplete in ways that eventually became embarrassing for the people who made them. The salesman's name was not important. What was important was the type. Mid-40s, hair arranged with some effort, shoes polished to a shine appropriate for a dinner, not a car lot at 10 in the morning. A man who had spent years developing an instinct for reading customers, for identifying what a person wanted before they said it, for calibrating his presentation to match his read on the room. He read Dean Martin. He read him as a celebrity who wanted to feel special, a man of means who needed to be handled with a particular combination of flattery and deference, a man who was, despite the fame and the money, still susceptible to being told that whatever he was being offered was elevated, exclusive, appropriate to his station. This was where the calculation went wrong. The thing about Dean Martin that was hardest to explain from the outside was that he was deeply, genuinely observant. The casualness was real. The ease was real. But underneath it, he was always watching. He had grown up in a house where you learned to read a room quickly, where missing a shift in tone had consequences. He had worked clubs where reading an audience was survival. He had spent a decade in a comedy partnership where he had to know exactly what Jerry was going to do before Jerry knew it himself, because if he did not anticipate it, the act fell apart. 20 years of that kind of reading had made him a man who absorbed information about other people at a rate that his relaxed exterior concealed entirely. He walked into that dealership and he read everything. The salesman's shoes, the angle of the man's shoulders, the way he adjusted his approach when he recognized Dean, the specific kind of adjustment, the calculation running behind the eyes, the decision being made. Dean let it happen. He had learned that patience in that moment, the patience to not correct someone, to let them finish their thought, was more revealing than anything you could learn by interrupting. Dean walked the first row slowly. He touched the hood of a coupe without looking at the salesman. He studied the color options with the unhurried attention of a man who was not in a hurry and was not going to be made to feel like he should be. He was doing what Dean always did when he entered a new situation. He was learning the room, reading the angles, deciding what kind of morning this was going to be. The salesman approached. He introduced himself. He offered a handshake and held it a half-second past comfortable. "These Mustangs," the salesman said, keeping his voice at the register of a man sharing a confidence, "they are really built for a particular kind of driver." Dean looked at him without answering. "A younger crowd, mostly," the salesman continued. "Athletes, men who are serious about performance, race enthusiasts, people who really know their way around a vehicle like this one. It is not exactly a Sunday drive car. You understand. Here is what nobody ever talks about. The moment right after someone says something like that, the words are out and the air changes. Something in the atmosphere of the conversation shifts, and the person on the receiving end knows it before they have fully processed what was said." Dean knew it. He registered it the way a musician registers a note that is slightly off, not with alarm, with attention. The salesman, committed now, kept going. "What I might suggest," he said, "for someone with your—" He paused, searching for the word. "Your lifestyle is something from our town car line. Very elegant, very refined, something more in keeping with—" He stopped. He had heard himself. Too late. Dean looked at the row of Mustangs. He looked at the white fastback at the end. He turned back to the salesman with an expression that contained nothing theatrical. No coldness, no performance of offense, just a clear, calm attention. "How many Mustangs do you have on the lot?" Dean said. The salesman blinked. "I beg your pardon." "On the lot? Around how many?" The salesman had 14 Mustangs on the lot that morning. 8 coupes, 4 convertibles, 2 fastbacks. Dean walked every row. All 14 cars he did not rush. He looked at colors. He opened doors. He sat in 2 of them. He asked about engine options, and about the timing on delivery, and about whether units could be brought in from other lots in the area if the selection here was not sufficient. The salesman followed at a slight distance. His recalibration was visible if you knew what to look for. The confidence draining by small increments. The smile becoming something he was working at rather than something he was doing. the realization arriving in stages. First, that this was not going the direction he had mapped. Then that this man was not browsing. Then something larger and less comfortable, which was the recognition that he had said the wrong thing to the wrong person, and there was no way to go back and not say it. "Can I ask who you are shopping for?" The salesman tried. He meant it to sound helpful. It came out sideways. "My crew," Dean said. The people I work with on my show, the camera operators, the lighting technicians, the stagehands, the floor crew, the men and women who come in every week and do the work that makes the thing function." He paused. "The ones you do not see when you watch the show." The salesman was quiet. "They are good at what they do," Dean said. "They have been good at it for years. And they do not always get seen for it. That has always bothered me." He stopped in front of a white fastback. He put his hand on the roof. The chrome caught the morning light. "I will take this one," he said. "And the red coupe. And the black convertible there in the second row. And the blue one next to it." Bah! He moved down the row. He pointed. He kept going. The salesman was writing. He had pulled out his order sheet, and he was writing, and he did not look up, because looking up would have meant processing what was happening, and processing what was happening would have required him to account for the distance between what he had assumed and what was actually true. There is a specific kind of silence that falls in a room when someone has been wrong in a way they cannot talk their way out of. Not an angry silence, not a punishing silence, just the quiet of a gap opening up between a man and his understanding of the world. The salesman was standing inside that quiet. His pen was moving. His face was still. Dean was not looking at him. Why would a man do that? What does it mean when someone in a position of power looks at the people beneath them in the hierarchy and decides, without obligation, without anyone asking, that those people deserve something real? And what does it do to the people around that man when they see it happen? Most men who walked into that situation would have walked off the lot. Most men who had heard what the salesman said would have made a scene, or made a cutting remark, or at minimum made the man feel the weight of his error in some direct and deliberate way. They would have turned the moment into a performance, a demonstration of who had the power here, a reminder that you do not speak to people like that. But Dean Martin was not most men. He did not embarrass the salesman. He did not raise his voice. He did not invoke his name or his show or his money as instruments of punishment. He used them instead as instruments of something else, something quieter, something that cut deeper than embarrassment because it did not give the other man a role to play or a posture to take. He simply bought the cars. He bought 11 Mustangs that morning. The dealership had to make calls to 2 other lots to fulfill the order. Dean told them he would wait. He sat in the salesman's office, and he drank the terrible coffee they offered him, and he waited with the patience of a man who had learned, across decades, that the thing worth doing was worth doing right. What he was going to do with those 11 cars was something the salesman did not fully understand until later. What it meant was something the salesman thought about for a long time after that morning. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, subscribe. We find the moments that did not make the columns, the ones that happened when the cameras were off and nobody was keeping the record. The next one is already waiting. The cars were delivered over 2 days. Dean arranged the logistics himself. Not through a manager, not through an assistant. He made the calls, and he tracked the details, and he followed up to make sure it was handled the way he wanted it handled. This was a thing about Dean that people underestimated separately from the rest of the underestimating. He was careful, not in a compulsive or anxious way, in the way a craftsman is careful, because he understood that the quality of a thing depended on the attention given to it, and he gave attention to the things that mattered to him. He had to call 3 different dealerships to get the full number of cars. The colors were specific. He had paid attention to the things the crew members mentioned in passing. One man had a daughter who liked blue. Another had been saving for a red car for 3 years and had not gotten there yet. Dean had not taken notes. He did not need to. He remembered because he had been listening when other people were not. That was the part that the salesman would never know. That the man he had dismissed as someone who needed to be redirected towards something more appropriate had spent more time genuinely paying attention to the people around him than most executives spent paying attention to their closest colleagues. The people on his crew mattered to him. That was not a performance. It was not a strategy. It was not the calculated generosity of a man who understood that a happy crew was a productive crew, though that was also true. It was something more personal and harder to explain, which was that Dean Martin remembered what it felt like to be the person in the room who was not quite seen. He had been that person, in rooms full of producers and executives and studio heads who looked past him to Frank, in interviews where journalists asked him about Jerry and waited politely through his answers to get to the question they actually wanted to ask, in reviews that called him charming without quite calling him talented. Charming was the word people used when they had not yet decided whether to take you seriously. He had earned the serious, but he had sat through the charming long enough to know what it cost. On the second morning of deliveries, the last 3 cars arrived at the studio. Dean did not make an event of it. He did not call the crew together. He did not stand in front of everyone with a speech and a microphone and his best camera-ready smile. That was not how he operated. That approach would have made it about him. It would have turned the gift into a performance, which would have made it smaller. The cars were simply there when the day ended, parked in a row in the lot outside the studio, each one with a handwritten note on the seat. One line. The person's name and the word, yours. 11 people walked out of the NBC studio on that afternoon and found a Mustang with their name in it. Here is what nobody talks about. Most of those men had never owned a new car. Some of them had worked in television production for 10 years or more and had never received anything from an employer beyond the agreed wage and a handshake at the holiday party. They were the people behind the cameras, the people who moved the equipment before the first guest arrived and moved it back after the last credit rolled. They were essential. They were also, in the accounting of celebrity, essentially invisible. Dean saw them. He had seen them from the beginning. One of the camera operators stood next to his car for a long time without getting in. He just stood there with the note in his hand. Another man from the lighting crew came and stood next to him. They did not speak. There was not anything that needed to be said. Some things communicate cleanly without language. Dean watched from a window on the 2nd floor of the building. He finished his drink. He turned back to the room. He did not mention it to anyone for the rest of the day. The story did not spread quickly. That was partly what gave it weight when it finally did. There was no mechanism in 1965 for something like this to travel fast. No platform. No photograph posted from a phone. Information moved through people, through conversation, through the chain of retelling that is also the chain of distortion. The crew talked to their wives and their children. Their wives mentioned it to neighbors. Someone at one of those dinner tables knew a newspaper columnist. The columnist mentioned it in 2 sentences in a piece about Dean's show buried near the end, attributed to no one in particular. Dean gave no statement about it. He was asked once, briefly, by a reporter who had heard a version of the story, and he said something about his crew being good people who deserved good things, and then changed the subject to something that had nothing to do with any of it. The reporter printed the quote. It ran in the middle of a longer profile. Nobody called it a headline. There was no publicist angle, no charitable foundation attached to it, no version of the story that had Dean as the protagonist of his own generosity, standing in front of a microphone explaining what he had done and why. He refused that version. He refused it not strategically but instinctively, the way you refuse something that feels wrong in your hands before you have reasoned out why it is wrong. He let it be what it was. This was consistent with something that people who knew Dean well talked about across decades. He had a deep resistance to performing virtue. He would do a generous thing without difficulty. He would refuse to explain it with equal ease. The explanation always felt, to him, like a corruption of the original thing, like adding a frame to something that was not meant to be framed. The salesman never appeared in any version of the story, not in the original telling, not in the versions that circulated through the years. Dean kept that part of it private. He did not use what had been said to him on the lot as justification for what he did. He did not let it become the origin story of the gesture, because then the salesman would have had a role in it, and he had not earned one. What had driven Dean to do it was older than that morning, deeper than a slight from a man trying to sell him a car. It came from the years in Steubenville, from the clubs, from the rooms where he had been assessed and found to be something less than what he actually was, from every moment in which someone's limited imagination had been presented to him as his ceiling. He had refused that ceiling, and he had tried, in the ways available to him, to make sure the people around him did not have to accept one either. The Dean Martin variety show ran for 9 seasons. From 1965 to 1974, the format was loose and the performances were warm, and Dean looked, every single week, like a man who had wandered in from a party in the other room and decided he might as well sing a few songs while he was here. The act was more constructed than it appeared, but the affection underneath it was real. The crew stayed, almost all of them, in an industry where people moved between shows and followed opportunity wherever it opened up. Dean's crew had an unusual continuity. Some of them were there at the beginning and still there at the end. Some of them talked about those years the way people talk about something they knew was good while it was happening, which is rarer than it sounds. The show produced some of the most watched television of the 1960s, guest lists that read like a catalog of American entertainment, performances that people still talk about. But the thing that the people who worked on it mentioned most often when they talked about those years was not the guests or the ratings. It was the atmosphere. The sense that the work was being taken seriously, even when the presentation was light. That they were in a place where what they did was visible and valued. That atmosphere does not come from nowhere. It comes from the person at the center of it. Whether the cars explained that loyalty was a question nobody could answer cleanly. Acts of genuine generosity are not transactions. They do not produce specific measurable outcomes. What they produce is an atmosphere, a context, a sense of what kind of place this is and what kind of person is at the center of it. And that atmosphere shapes everything that happens inside it, in ways too diffuse to trace and too real to ignore. Dean had other losses coming that he did not know about yet in 1965. His son Dino, who became a successful actor in his own right, died in a plane crash in 1987. Dean was 70 years old. He was playing Las Vegas. He got the call, and he walked off the stage, and he did not come back to it the same way. Some losses hit a person in a specific register that other losses do not. Dean had lost friends before. He had watched people leave the world who mattered to him. Each of those had marked him in ways that were visible to the people who knew him well. But Dino was different. Dino was the thing that organized something essential inside him, and when that thing went, the organization went with it. There was a comeback planned, a tour with Frank and Sammy. Dean pulled out after 4 shows. He said his heart was not in it. That was accurate in a way that went beyond the literal. Frank was furious in the way Frank got furious, which was total and loud and eventually settled back into something that resembled acceptance. Sammy understood. He had his own version of the thing Dean was carrying, and he recognized the shape of it. Dean spent his final years quietly. Dinner at the same restaurant, the same booth, the same drink. A man who had arrived at a kind of stillness that was not peace exactly, but was something you could live inside. Some of the crew members reached out after Dino died. Cards and phone calls and 1 or 2 visits. Dean took the calls. He talked about ordinary things, not the show, not the cars. About life and how it goes and what you are left with. He never said much about what he was left with. But the calls kept coming. For years, from people he had employed 3 decades earlier, from the people behind the cameras, the ones no one sees. They still saw him. This is not a story about Mustangs. This is a story about what it means to recognize someone, not their name, not their credit, not their useful function in a structure that benefits you, them. The person standing in front of you who has been doing a thing with care and skill, and has not been told, in any language that carries real weight, that it has been noticed. Dean Martin spent his entire adult life being recognized in the most public and shallow way possible, recognized in the sense of being known, being watched, being applauded and photographed and called by name by strangers in restaurants. He was recognized that way constantly. But being recognized that way and being seen are different things. He understood that difference from the inside. He had been seen by very few people and recognized by millions, and he knew what each of those felt like and which one mattered. The salesman on the lot was operating on the logic of recognition. He saw Dean Martin, the name, the celebrity, the category of person. He adjusted his pitch accordingly. He was not wrong about the category. He was wrong about the person inside it. That is the mistake people make with someone like Dean. They see the surface, which was considerable, and they assume the surface explains everything underneath. The ease, the glass in hand, the half smile. They read those things and they decide they know what kind of man this is, what he wants, what he responds to, what he should be offered. They miss the Steubenville kid, the club circuit, the decade of being underestimated, the accumulation of rooms in which someone looked at him and saw something smaller than what was actually there. They miss the part of Dean Martin that never forgot any of that and quietly, without drama or announcement, organized his life around not doing that to other people. Think about someone in your life who sees you, who holds the actual shape of who you are, not the role you fill or the service you provide, who remembers the specific things you mentioned once and follows up on them later, who treats the thing you do as though the care you put into it is visible and real. That person is rare. The attention required for that kind of seeing is rare. Most people do not have the capacity for it, not because they are bad, but because they are occupied with their own business and their own stakes and their own version of what is important. Dean chose to pay that attention to the people around him, to the people the industry had decided were background. Seeing is not about intention. Meaning to notice someone and actually noticing them are not the same thing. The salesman on that lot in 1965 probably meant no particular harm. He was operating on assumption, on the shorthand his experience had given him, on the quick read he had developed over years of meeting people and deciding who they were. He meant to be helpful. He was categorizing, and his categories were too small. The people we overlook are rarely overlooked in a single moment. They are overlooked in 100 small moments, each one unremarkable on its own, that accumulate into something that shapes what a person believes about their own worth and their own visibility. Dean knew that, and he decided, sometime before 1965 and probably a long time before, that he was going to choose differently. 11 cars, 11 notes, 11 lines that said nothing more than a name and a word. Yours, one lot, 14 Mustangs in rows under a California morning. A man with a practiced pitch and a mistaken read on his customer. A man who listened, let it land, and then went about his business. Dean Martin never explained the morning at the dealership. He never explained the cars. He never explained the notes on the seats, or the waiting, or the fact that he arranged it himself, when he could have delegated every piece of it. He did not explain himself. That was who he was. If stories like this are what you come here for, subscribe. The playlist is waiting. These are the stories that matter. The ones that happen between the famous moments. The ones that tell you who someone actually was, not who they appeared to be when the cameras were on. There was a moment late in that second afternoon, when the deliveries were done and the lot was empty except for Dean's own car. The California light was going gold, the way it does in the late afternoon, the way it makes everything look like something worth preserving. Dean sat behind the wheel for a moment before he started the engine. 11 people were driving home. 11 families would sit down to a different kind of conversation that evening. 11 men who had shown up to work and done the work and gone largely unacknowledged were, on this particular evening, going home in something that said, "I see you. I know what you do. It matters." Dean started the engine. He pulled out of the lock. He did not look back. He drove home in his own car, which was not a Mustang, and had dinner and did not mention any of it. That was Dean. That was the one morning that never really ended.